Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here, but I don't have time to express that gladness, so I won't. And I want to start by making 3 apologies. The first apology concerns my voice. Yesterday morning, my voice was gone. This morning, it came back. I'm very happy. I'm not sure it stays back. I will focus my presentation and my paper on the other Keynesians, namely the new Keynesians. I'm very sorry. Yeah. And the third apology is that I need 20,000 words and 30 figures to make my point. Again, bear with me. Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay, why do I spend so much time and effort on making the point that the new Keynesian approach, or what is called the science of monetary policy, is simply not so useful? I think, and that's sort of the motivation of the paper, that is because these people, these colleagues of ours, I mean, I see them as colleagues, they don't see me as a colleague. Okay, there's a problem. These colleagues of mine basically take the moral and academic high ground. They monopolize debates, and they are everywhere, and they even state this utterly strange claim that they are a science of monetary policy. Now, then, I mean, that is sort of, in Dutch we have a saying, tall trees catch a lot of wind. Must be in German as well, something similar. It basically means that if you make strong claims and if you think of yourself as being very important, please expect some critique and criticism. Yeah, and don't be angry with the person who is giving the critique, because it's like you're doing it yourself. So I want to sort of look at how good or bad the science of monetary policy has been able to deal with the recent surge in inflation. Yeah, I mean, we could say that from between 2008 and 2020, inflation was not really a problem. Inflation was hibernating, asleep. The Phillips curve was flat, also hibernating. Some people even said the Phillips curve is dead. Anyway, inflation was not a problem. Yeah, everybody was maybe happy about it. Now it's a problem. It's a big problem. What does the science of monetary policy learn us, or what does it do in dealing with this sudden re-emergence of inflation? Yeah, and it's also important because, as you know, the new Keynesian science of monetary policy is expressly, I mean, it's stated, a forward-looking project. Yeah. Rational expectations, inflation expectations as such matter a lot. Central bank is doing forward guidance. I mean, we don't talk about worker bargaining. We don't talk about we talk about so many almost esoteric things, but it's all in a forward-looking manner. So, what happened? They didn't see it coming. Okay, maybe we also didn't see it coming. Maybe not many people saw the inflation coming. So that is not the big deal. It is a bigger deal for them because they are supposedly claiming to be rationally forward-looking. Yeah, they also have the true model of the economy. Yeah, I mean, sorry for all of you here in the audience. Yeah, I mean, they have the true model of the economy. And okay, so the true model of the economy. What does it tell us about the inflation? Now, the problem is, and I have now to go into technology. I work in a university of technology. And some people in the audience know that I'm not a great technology person. Anyway, it worked. So the problem is that all these standard indicators proposed by the scientists of monetary policy, that's the output gap, the unemployment gap, things having to do with inflation expectations, and also the whole notion of the Phillips curve, all these concepts failed to work. Yeah, the output gap remained was negative, was not giving a signal that the economy is overheating. I'll come to these indicators in more detail. The problem was, like most people, most experts even, the scientists of monetary policy were caught flat-footed. Yeah, it's like inflation suddenly emerged, and then there was a reaction. Yeah, some of the problems I already mentioned. The basic point is that the hardcore indicators of the science of monetary policy didn't work. This is a graph. On the left-hand side, there is the output gap, which is gray. You can see the output gap is negative throughout almost the complete period. And you can see the black bars, inflation is increasing. So what we have is rising inflation and a negative output gap. Oh dear, Houston, we have a problem indeed. Then there is this other graph. On the horizontal axis, we have the unemployment gap, which is negative, and we have inflation. And there are 3 periods and 3 colors. The gray colors are the end of the 1990s, and the black color is 2018, 2019, and the red is the exceptional case, the recent years with high inflation. You can see that the unemployment gaps in 2021, 2022, 2023 are not really exceptionally negative. Yeah? They are actually quite moderately negative. Nevertheless, we have huge inflation. That is, again, the unemployment gap itself was not forecasting this or giving us a clue. Then, inflation expectations. In the paper, I explained this in much greater detail, but the point is that the Fed itself was wrong, incorrect in its inflation expectations. The Cleveland Federal Reserve inflation expectations for 5 years ahead basically stayed very close to 2.5%. So what it means is that longer term, the short-run inflation expectations were basically following actual inflation. Longer-term inflation expectations stayed more or less flat, which means that the experts at the Federal Reserve were basically thinking that inflation would be transitory, would level off quite rapidly. Yeah. Other indicators, the bond yield curve for U.S. bonds, did not signal ahead of the event that inflation would happen. It's also sort of more or less a reactive indicator, and in addition to that, the longer term, the spreads, like 5 years ahead or 10 years ahead, are also, in general, not very powerful in predicting what actually will happen with inflation. Yeah, there's a long story to tell about how we measure inflation and who are the people who are sort of telling us what expected inflation is going to be. Households have different expectations than businesses. Expert observers have different expectations than firms. Most firm CEOs do not even know what the, let's say up to 2022 or so, they didn't even know what the inflation target of the Federal Reserve was, and they also don't know what the rate of inflation roughly was. So, I mean, this whole notion of rational economic actors who are working on the basis of inflation expectations and the Federal Reserve using forward guidance it is all quite a stretch. Yeah. So there's a problem. Yeah. And what do you do if you have a paradigm? No, what do you do when you have very strong and powerful and well-paid university positions and you monopolize the top journals and you have gatekeepers and basically you have insulated yourself from reality but also in sort of created a powerful basis? What do you do when your paradigm sort of clashes into a wall, and that wall is called reality? Yeah. I think John Kenneth Galbraith put the point very well. Faced with the choice between changing your view, that is your paradigm, and proving that there is no need to do so, the scientist of monetary policy, maybe this is very human, the scientist of monetary policy just got busy on the proof. Yeah? And that is what I try to explain in the paper. I introduce old Greek scientist Ptolemy. Maybe I'm doing a favor to him. But anyway, I talk about epicycles, and I'm basically saying the scientists of monetary policy are trying to keep the core of their paradigm protected, and what they do is they add very ad hoc, very sort of just so epicycles to their core, and then they try to tell us that the whole model and their whole paradigm is still operational and still useful. And the biggest usefulness of that paradigm, of course, is to predict what has happened. Yeah, that is actually the greatest sort of test. Yeah. Now, the first epicycle I talk about is that the scientists of monetary policy are no longer talking about output gap or unemployment gap. All of a sudden, there's just one indicator which is all over, and that is the vacancy ratio. And the vacancy ratio, that is the number of vacancies per unemployed worker in the US, and it is also true in the Netherlands, and I think in many other European countries, the vacancy ratio has actually exploded. Yeah, the long-term average value of the vacancy ratio is maybe 0.57, but in recent years, the vacancy ratio has increased to 2, which means 2 vacancies per unemployed worker. If that is not a signal of labor market tightness, then what other signal can we think of? Yeah, this is, of course, an indicator that the labor market is extremely tight. This happens only in a wartime situation. This is what people write in these papers. They didn't say which war. Okay, but okay. Yeah, so this is, and the data don't go back to the Vietnam War or whatever. But anyway, this is extreme. Yeah, the whole point, of course, is we have to think about why the vacancy ratio has increased so strongly. Is it a sign of labor market tightness, or are we not correctly measuring what we want to measure? We want to measure how hot the labor market is, and maybe the vacancy ratio is not really giving us that signal. Yeah, that's the first question. I mean, if there is such an extreme change in the vacancy ratio or in this particular indicator, that is what one would ask. No questions are asked by the scientists of monetary policy, they just apply it. But if we ask the question, why did the vacancy ratio increase so much, then we can think of answers. First of all, first point is the recent high vacancy ratios are clear outliers. Yeah, it's sort of historically, it's extreme. At the same time, the vacancy ratio increased. At the same time, the quit rate increased. That means people are quitting jobs. Yeah, of course, this had to do with the COVID crisis, people leaving dangerous jobs, people going for early retirement, people with children having problem with childcare, leaving their. Anyway, there are plenty of reasons why many people were leaving their jobs. But it's not just quitting and creating vacancies; it's also people transiting, people moving from one job to another job. So the quit rate, the vacancy ratio increased, the quit rate increased, but also the job-to-job transition ratio or rate increased. Yeah, so what we have is not what the press, the media was saying, a great resignation, that people going for retirement and leaving the labor force and so on. No, because even discouraged workers, like millions in the US, millions of discouraged workers who left the labor force in 2021, or 2020, 2021, 7 million of them have returned to the labor force. Yeah, they are not counted as unemployed here, and in the standard vacancy ratio. The job transitions also increased enormously. So instead of a great resignation, we are talking about a great restructuring of occupations, a massive restructuring of occupations for the reasons which are all related to the demise of certain occupations, mostly close contact, in-person service activities, and the rise of delivery jobs, tech jobs, online services jobs, and so on. So it's a complete reworking of the occupational structure in a very short period of time. And that can be taken into account. We can actually redefine the conventional vacancy ratio by taking into account the number of people who are switching jobs, J to J, yeah, the job-to-job transition. And we can also include the discouraged workers in the denominator, U6, that is the number of people marginally attached to the labor force or discouraged, which are not counted in the narrow definition of unemployment, U3. If we revise our definition of the vacancy ratio, what we see is we get a very different picture. First of all, the vacancy ratio is not 2, but much below 1. And you can also see that the alternative vacancy ratios do not rise as steeply as the standard conventional vacancy ratio, which basically means that, or what it shows is that there is a big increase in job-to-job transitions. Put differently, or in sum, what it means is Maybe the US labor market is not so tight. In any case, we have to think much more deeply about the vacancy ratio. What we can also do is look at other indicators. Well, poor scientists of monetary policy, the other indicators are basically saying the labor market is not hot. Number of hours worked per week is declining. I mean, if there's an excess demand for labor, how is that possible? The employment rate is also not really catching up very quickly. It has catched up, but it took almost the whole period from mid-2020 until now. Again, not overheating. Real wages have fallen. Real wages are now growing, but still real wages are down 7% or so compared to the beginning of 2020. Yeah, in an extreme, like this, these are not my words, in an extremely tight labor market, workers fail to bring about real wage increases. This would be strange. Yes, it would be sort of a, I mean, this is simply not believable. Yeah, household incomes decline. Also, the labor income share. I mean, again, workers are what we see is a very tight labor market. Very tight labor market, labor income share is just going down. Anyway, the point is that I think this very quick jump by the scientists of monetary policy to this particular notion, indicator, the vacancy ratio, which then becomes the hero of their story. And the story, of course, is the labor market is tight, wages are increasing, there is a wage price spiral, the Federal Reserve has to tighten monetary policy. That jump is a jump of logic, a jump of faith, a jump of whatever. It is simply bad science. Yeah, if we talk about science, this is bad science. Anyway, second epicycle, I will be a bit briefer. That is the point that whatever happens, the scientists of monetary policy continue to hammer on the fact that there is a there's a wage price spiral. If the wage price spiral is not yet happening, then the risk of a wage price spiral is growing. Yeah, it's like either that way or that way. We always end up with wage push inflation. The story starts with the Biden administration spent so much on pandemic relief. That led to extra spending, extra demand. That led to a very tight labor market. Look at the vacancy ratio, and the very tight labor market, of course, leads to high wage growth, and that is triggering a wage price spiral. If not now, then possibly very soon. Now, the point is that each of these steps are not validated. It is simply not believable, again, or not plausible to argue that the public spending in 2020 and 2021 led to excess demand. The output gap remained negative throughout. Detailed studies by Asdourian and others, and Parker and Schild, and also a paper written by Tom Ferguson and myself, we basically show that this is not a plausible argument. The tightness of the labor market cannot be measured using the standard vacancy ratio. I mean, it is compromised, it's difficult, it's problematic, and there is also no evidence of a wage price spiral. This picture I will skip. It's a long story, but I mean, the bottom line is Lawrence Summers, together with a student of his, probably has been sort of writing papers to fuel the fear for a wage price spiral. And apart from the fact that the empirical or statistical analysis which is done in those papers is very, very poor, the model also has no explanatory power. Yeah, and I've added the black dots are the observations for the latest period. Anyway, it takes too long to explain, but the point is the model doesn't fit what happens at all, and there is simply no evidence of wage price spiral. This I've added. I will be brief. I'm not a big fan of linear Granger causality testing, but okay, if we think about wage growth and inflation, and we have data, then why not just try out and do a Granger causality test? I have to thank my student Carlotta Breeman for doing those tests, because I myself cannot do them. so the whole point here is that if you perform these tests, you will see that for the US, and this for almost more than 50 years and roughly 700 data points, inflation is pulling up wage growth and not the other way around. Yeah? And that this is not the first. I mean, there are serious studies by Fed researchers and other researchers published where they also do Granger causality tests, and they find basically the same result. Yeah, so that is the second epicycle. The third epicycle tried to be 5. Okay, well, I'm not sure. I'm reasonably on schedule, I think. Yeah. Okay, the basic idea is that up to the sudden re-emergence of inflation, everybody was talking about how and why the Phillips curve had become flatter. Yeah, and if you look at the almost horizontal line, that is the pre-pandemic Phillips curve, you could say it's almost horizontal, very flat. And then the strange thing is that if you add the data points for the recovery period, 2021 up to now, you see that you can actually draw a much steeper Phillips curve, of course, based on only 10 observations. So the point, of course, is that the statistical validity of this is also very dubious. But if you take the two things, if you take the two data samples together, you could, with a little bit of imagination, say that, okay, if we look at the Phillips curve, it actually is becoming steeper. Yes, it is becoming steeper. And what does that mean? It means that small changes in the unemployment gap may now lead to labor market tightness and higher inflation. Yeah, there is a paper by two new Keynesian economists, Benigno and Eggertson, and instead of using the unemployment gap as the measure of economic activity, they use the already discussed vacancy ratio as the measure of economic activity. So we have the vacancy ratio on the horizontal axis, which means that the vacancy ratio goes up to 2, and number 2 jobs, vacant jobs per unemployed worker, and you can see that if inflation is on the vertical axis, you can see that inflation is sort of, the more the vacancy ratio increases, the higher is the rate of inflation. I have already explained that this is a spurious correlation, so it's simply not giving a causal mechanism. The story by Benigno and Eggertson is the story I already told. The vacancy ratio is the primary indicator of labor market tightness. Biden administration made a stupid mistake, spending too much. Demand exploded or increased too much. The labor market became tight. The vacancy ratio was pushed above the threshold value of 1. And that then immediately kickstarts workers become powerful and workers start to demand higher wages, and they get these higher wages. And we get inflation. Yeah, so the Phillips curve becomes steep. The good news for central bankers is that steep Phillips curve means that the sacrifice ratio of monetary policy becomes relatively small. That means small increases in the interest rate will do the job. Yeah, that is, and there is. I like this statement by Robert Solow that monetary tightening can work, but in many cases it is very dubious policy because it amounts to burning down the house in order to roast the pig. Yeah, and if the sacrifice ratio is low, then that is not necessary. Yeah, you don't have to burn the house, maybe only part of the house. Okay, now, and then, of course, the point is that if we then plug this, all of this into, if we take a core, the hard core of the DSG model, and we plug all these things as epicycles onto that DSG model, and if that model then generates results which show that inflation indeed happens if there is excessive spending, then it must be true, or it must be the case that this is true. Yeah, this is sort of this is a big method. I'm not a methodology person, but I think there's also really 2 or 3 papers to write on what the exact methodology is here. 0. That is okay. Okay, here is a figure that is worth more than 1,000 words, so that's saving me a lot of time. This is again the vacancy ratio, but instead of inflation on the vertical axis, I have posted nominal wage growth. And you can see that the high vacancy ratios go together with quite nominal wage growth. In other words, nominal wage growth is quite within historical bounds. The vacancy ratio is outside of historical bounds. The two things simply do not match. Yeah, I can now also say QED. Yeah, okay, this I will do very quickly. The whole point, of course, is that the wage price spiral narratives are based on this notion that workers have bargaining power, etc. And I think that is simply assuming too much. Yeah, and Lawrence Summers, and probably this is the influence of his student, who has a better view of reality than he has. They together co-authored the paper saying there is a structural decline in American worker bargaining power. And if that took 40 years to erode worker bargaining power in the US, then of course one corona crisis and all the other problems, that is not something which then completely reverses this. I mean, this would be also worth a couple of articles, but it's simply implausible. Yeah. Now, I'll stop. For those of you who like to go through this, I'll show the two slides, but it's basically, you can ask the question, how do they manage to get away with it? Yeah, of course, by just sort of making their points. Yeah, it's like by being arrogant, by being ignorant and arrogant, maybe. That is a very smart strategy. So these are some of the lessons I draw out from the paper. I think they are all mostly fallacies.